Last year, I reviewed the iPod Touch 7th generation, a slightly more capable device than its predecessor. But how does it hold up in 2020? We discussed that in this episode of The Rewind, iPod Touch 7 Edition. So the iPod Touch 7th generation starts off at just $200, and it is the cheapest way to get into the iOS ecosystem as far as a brand new device is concerned. So the 32 gigabyte version will set you back about $200. Now this device has a 4-inch display, and inside it has an A10 Fusion CPU. This is the same CPU found in the original iPhone 7. Coincidentally, it's also the same chip that Apple uses in its 7th generation iPad. But as I noted in our original iPod Touch 7th generation review, this is actually a downclocked version of the A10 Fusion. So you're going to see that it actually performs worse, from Geekbench perspective at least, than the iPhone 7, which was released a long time ago, right? And it also performs worse than the iPad 7, which was released last year, which also has that A10 Fusion chip. So the reason for that, I believe, is because Apple wants to save on battery life, since this guy doesn't have a lot of room for battery. So by underclocking the CPU, they're able to save on battery life, which is super important for a device this small. And it makes sense why Apple would do this, because as I've used this device with iOS 13, I've played Apple Arcade games, it does eat through battery life pretty quickly. So the iPad 7, which, like I said, also has the A10 Fusion chip, is going to be slightly snappier than the 7th generation iPod Touch, because not only is the CPU clocked higher, but it also features 3 gigabytes of RAM versus only 2 gigabytes of RAM on the 7th generation iPod Touch. But the biggest difference between the iPod and iPad 7 is the size. I mean, obviously, the iPod Touch 4-inch display, very tiny device, super thin, thinnest iOS device you can get, is way more pocketable and portable than the iPad 7. But that being said, the iPad 7, in my opinion, is the much better buy. It starts at $329 officially, but you can get this thing for about $250 on sale. So that means that the 7th generation iPad, you can pick it up for only about $50 more than the entry-level iPod Touch, which to me makes it a no-brainer. After comparing the two, I'd much rather have the iPad. So how does the iPod Touch perform as a music player? Well, I'll just say right off the bat that the built-in speaker sounds terrible, so avoid that at all costs. But it does include a built-in 3.5mm headphone jack, which is nice. That means I can plug in my favorite headphones with no sort of dongles or anything like that. Literally just plug it right in. The iPad has that as well. So that is a very nice feature to have, especially if you don't use wireless headphones, you don't already own a pair of AirPods, you love the way your traditional headphones sound. That's a nice feature to have, that built-in headphone jack. Now, of course, Apple also includes the Lightning EarPods, which sound, mediocre at best. I definitely avoid using those if at all possible. If you don't want to use wired headphones, I definitely recommend getting something like the AirPods or AirPods Pro. The Pro versions sound great. Check out our full review for more details. Pairs up nicely with the iPod Touch. But I think the iPod Touch is actually not the best iPod that Apple sells nowadays. In fact, I think the Apple Watch is actually a better iPod than the iPod Touch. It's way more portable. I mean, it straps to your wrist, and it has built-in cellular connectivity. And when you have an Apple Music account, you can use your AirPods to wirelessly talk to your Apple Watch and ask it to play any of the millions of songs available on Apple Music. Indeed, it's a better iPod than the iPod. So if it's not the best music experience, then what is this thing for? Well, Apple's really pushing the iPod Touch as sort of a portable gaming machine. You can see it on their product marketing page for the iPod Touch. Apple Arcade is a very prominent part of the iPod Touch marketing pages. And for good reason, the iPod Touch makes for a pretty good portable gaming machine. I think it's especially nice for children with small hands. They can easily take hold of the iPod Touch, play games, and there are tons of games. The great thing about Apple Arcade, though, is that it's a $5 a month subscription. You get access to all the games on the service, It's multi-platform, so it works on your iPhone, your iPad, your Apple TV, your Mac, your iPod Touch. You can download the games directly to your device, the full game, so you don't need an internet connection to play. And that's perfect for the iPod Touch, which only has Wi-Fi connectivity. And Apple Arcade is family sharing enabled, so you can share that $5 subscription with 5 additional household members. That makes it a no-brainer deal in my opinion, and it makes the iPod Touch at $200 a pretty good portable gaming machine. And while the A10 Fusion is underpowered on paper, almost every game that I tried on the service on the iPod Touch 7 played pretty good. I mean, there are some frame rate stutters here and there, but even games like Hot Lava played back fairly well. I was actually surprised at how well the games performed. And no doubt Apple curates the Apple Arcade titles, so they make sure that they all work well with all the devices that are compatible with Apple Arcade. The one thing you have to keep in mind though is that the size of these games can get fairly large. So if you have a 32GB iPod Touch, you're not obviously going to be able to download all the games at the same time. Now, all that said, the iPod Touch is still a very tiny device at only 4 inches. It's super thin and super small. And that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that you can easily put your iPod Touch in your pocket and actually even forget that it's even in there. Obviously, you can't do that with the iPad 7, unless you have massive pockets, right? Another problem with the iPod Touch is that it's not really designed as a game machine. For instance, when you hold it in landscape mode, you cover up the speaker and the speakers get all muffled and it just doesn't sound all that good. Now, granted, you're going to be able to use wireless headphones, but that's just one of the things that shows you that this device wasn't designed as a gaming console from the beginning. Sort of just fell into that over time. Another problem that I experienced with the iPod Touch 7th generation is that my fingers and hands, which are fairly large, interferes with the gameplay because the screen is both the controller and the display, right? So your fingers sort of block and obscure what's happening on screen. Now, iOS 13 supports controllers like the Xbox controller and the PlayStation DualShock controller, so that's a cool thing, but it's kind of weird to control an iPod, which is so small, with the controller. Maybe if you had one of those little mounts for your controller, it would be a lot better. But that's really one of the biggest downsides of the iPod Touch. It's just small, and we're used to devices that are much larger these days, like this 11 Pro Max, which makes the iPod Touch look really, really tiny. Speaking of making something look tiny, the iPad 7 is a massive 10.2-inch display, and it costs just about $50 more than that iPod Touch. The display alone makes it the better device for gaming in my opinion. You also have things like better speakers, which make a big difference for immersiveness. There's also niceties like Touch ID for quickly unlocking your device. You don't get that on the iPod. Neither device is good for the camera, but the iPad does have the ability to use an Apple Pencil and the smart keyboard. So that's something to keep in mind as well if you want to get the most out of your tablet, both as a gaming machine and a work machine and a content consumption machine for like watching Netflix and things like that. Then the iPad 7 is hands down the better choice. It's just a no-brainer. For instance, in my opinion, coming from an iPhone 11 Pro Max, using a 4-inch display just feels weird now. Even though I love the iPhone SE, which also had a 4-inch display, it just feels really small in 2020. So my final thoughts on the iPod Touch are as follows. I think it's a pretty good Apple Arcade machine. If you have small children with small hands, then the 7th generation iPod Touch works fairly well as an Apple Arcade portable gaming console. You can find this thing brand new for $200 and you may be able to find it even cheaper than that on sale. That makes the 7th generation iPod Touch the cheapest way to get into a brand new iOS 13 enabled device. But even with that said, I'd recommend spending the extra $50 on an iPad 7. You'll thank me later, trust me on that one. Unless portability is at the very top of your priority list, then it goes without saying that you should skip the iPod Touch 7th generation and get yourself a 7th generation iPad instead. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on the iPod Touch 7th generation? Do you own one? How do you like it? Let me know down below in the comments section. Thumbs up if you appreciate this video, and subscribe for more videos like this. This is Jeff with 9 to 5 Mac.